If taking notes is so important and so valuable, then why do so many of us stop taking notes when we leave school? The answer is that many of those notes are no longer relevant outside of traditional schooling. In short, many notes lose their relevance and usefulness when they're not put in the right context. But how do we know what that context is? In this video, I'm going to talk about an Obsidian plugin called ExcaliBrain that may just help us put our notes in the right contexts. ExcaliBrain is an Obsidian plugin that was created by a developer named Zoltvitsian. You may remember Zolt because he's the same developer that created Excalidraw, the integration between the Excalidraw app and Obsidian that lets you do drawings and add visual representations into your notes. ExcaliBrain is a little bit different. The way that I like to think of it is that Excalidraw helps you textualize your visuals so that all of your images can now have tags and can actually be searchable within your Obsidian vault. ExcaliBrain does the opposite. It takes something that is primarily textual, your notes, and makes them visual. It is a way to explore your vault visually. Now, you may think that ExcaliBrain replicates a lot of the functionality of the Obsidian Graph View, which comes by default with every Obsidian installation. However, as the number of notes in my vaults have grown, I've had a lot of performance issues with the Graph View, and I still think it's a good place to start. But it doesn't really show a lot of meaningful relationships, and it doesn't let you control what those relationships are. So what is ExcaliBrain for? Well, in one of my previous videos, I talked about how visual note-taking can be used in a variety of purposes within Obsidian, and that's to capture, explain, track, aggregate, or contextualize your notes. Now, ExcaliBrain isn't going to be the one that you use for capturing, explaining, or tracking. You would probably want to use something like Excalidraw for that. What ExcaliBrain is good for is in the aggregation and the contextualization. So before you install ExcaliBrain, you will need a few other plugins, namely the DataView and Excalidraw plugins. Now, both of those plugins are ones that I would recommend anyway, and they're useful in their own right. So I think you should install both of those and then just add ExcaliBrain to it. Without either of those plugins, ExcaliBrain isn't going to work. It also works well with a plugin called Hover Editor, but that's not required. You may also find a reference to another plugin called Breadcrumbs in some of the older ExcaliBrain documentation. Don't worry about that, it's no longer necessary, and all you need are DataView and Excalidraw. And then go ahead and install ExcaliBrain and enable that as well. Let's get right into the options so that I can show you what you need to change. I wouldn't really worry too much about many of these because it's quite daunting. There's a lot that you can change about how ExcaliBrain works, and that's kind of difficult to determine until you've used it a little bit. So what I would recommend is to maybe change the file path of this ExcaliBrain drawing. I like to put it under its own folder, but maybe you want to just leave it as a markdown file in your root directory. So how it works is that ExcaliBrain is going to create a markdown file within your vault, and it's always going to use that same markdown file to visualize anything that you've asked it to. ExcaliBrain is a plugin that has a lot of depth, so I find it useful to talk about using it in terms of 4 different levels. In the first level, you can let it infer relationships. So I'm going to leave most of these the same, but I do want to point out this section ontology here. As you can see, there are different kind of keywords that are set for parents, children, and friends. ExcaliBrain hinges upon relationships, and in ExcaliBrain there are 4 different ways that 2 notes could be related. They could be parents, children, siblings, or friends. You can think of a parent note as maybe a folder or an overarching topic, or something that is a little bit broader in scope or implementation. An example of a parent note could be something like role-playing games. And then a child note, by contrast, is something that sits under or below the parent note in some way. So that could be because the child note is more specific, or it is an implementation of an idea that was in the parent note. So in our example, maybe a child of the note role-playing games could be Dungeons and Dragons or D&D. The third type of relationship is called friends. Now, a friend is a note that kind of sits off to the side from a child note, and it is related in some way, and maybe there's a bit of topical overlap, but it doesn't have the same parent, so it is not directly related. An example of this would be a note that I have called character creation. Now, character creation is related to Dungeons and Dragons for me because part of character creation is creating characters for D&D games and other role-playing games. But it could also mean, creating characters in a fictional novel or even a little bit of personality stuff for just my own personal interest. So it is related, but not 100%. And in that case, that character creation note is called a friend relationship. So kind of on the same level, but there's a little bit of distance. Let's contrast that to the fourth type of relationship, which is siblings. A sibling note is like a friend, except that it has the same parents as another note. So in our example, let's say I have another note called Pathfinder. Now, Pathfinder is another type of role-playing game, which I also play every week. So it's on the same level as Dungeons and Dragons, and it does belong within the role-playing game sort of genre, or the parent note, and that means that Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder are siblings in this example. Now, you might get confused because in ExcaliBrain, only 3 of these relationships are going to be shown for you to set. And that's because the fourth type, siblings, are entirely inferred. So it just sees that if you have notes that would be friends, but they have the same parent, then they are siblings. In practice, however, the difference between siblings and friends I haven't found to be extremely useful. Maybe I'm wrong, but in my case, I kind of just use them interchangeably. This might be a little bit confusing, but let's just go to the practical examples and maybe it'll make a little bit more sense. These are those 3 relationships here in the settings, and ExcaliBrain already has a few default kind of keywords that it uses to determine which node is a parent, child, or friend of another. I would suggest that you'd leave all of these settings as they are and just start using it and then seeing what you'd like to change. So this is the template vault that I give to my Patreons because I want to show you how to set up ExcaliBrain in a fresh vault that doesn't have it yet. Let's make sure that ExcaliBrain has that ExcaliBrain folder that I talked about so that it always creates that file in there. Let me create a folder here called test, just so my Patreons aren't confused about what's in here. And within that, I'm going to create a note called observability. And I'll put that boilerplate in there. And I'm also going to create another note that is called monitoring. So now let's go to the command pane and use ExcaliBrain for the first time. Now there are a few different ways to use ExcaliBrain. I almost always just go and click on ExcaliBrain pop-out window because I think that's just clearly the best way to use it. So I'm going to click on that now, and you'll see that now there are 2 different windows for Obsidian. We still see the original notes that I had there, but now they're also showing in this other view. But it's showing observability all on its own. That's because there are no relationships yet that it can infer from what I've got here. There are 2 ways for ExcaliBrain to figure out what the relationship is between 2 nodes. The first is by inferring it, and the second is by looking at the parameters that you've set. First, let's look at how it infers it. If I then type something like monitoring is a part of observability, and now I'm linking to the monitoring page, let's see what it looks like in ExcaliBrain. Now we see that observability is no longer on its own, and it's actually pointing to monitoring. In fact, observability appears above monitoring, and that's because when you create a link to another page, then that page that you link to is considered a child. So in this relationship, observability is the parent and monitoring is the child. Let's see how different this would be if I had done it the other way around. So let me go to the monitoring note and I'll say monitoring is a part of observability. Now, if I go back to the ExcaliBrain window, you'll see that the positions have been reversed, and now ExcaliBrain is looking at monitoring as the parent and observability as the child, which isn't what we wanted. So I will go back to the observability page and put in that note from earlier. What if we wanted to create a sibling of, let's say, monitoring? Well, let's create another note, and I'm going to call it instrumentation. And in the observability note, I'm going to say monitoring and instrumentation are parts of observability. So when we head back to ExcaliBrain, we'll see that observability is the parent and has two children, instrumentation and monitoring. This means that instrumentation and monitoring are siblings, but they're not friends. That's because there isn't a relationship between them yet. Let's change that. The way that ExcaliBrain infers friendship is when two nodes mutually link to each other. So if we say in monitoring, like instrumentation is part of observability, and we say in instrumentation like monitoring is part of observability. Now let's go back to ExcaliBrain and see how the graph has changed. Now instrumentation and monitoring have this dashed line between them, and that's because at this point they are both friends and siblings. I know that's a little difficult to grasp. I think it takes a little bit of time to understand the complexities of the relationships in ExcaliBrain, and I had to go back to the developer Zolt more than a few times to get clear on this concept myself. But the important thing is that you can use these relationships already and start playing around with what you want them to be. Let's go over the ExcaliBrain interface. Right now, the focus of ExcaliBrain is on observability, and that's because that's the last one that we had put our cursor on. So then if we go back to ExcaliBrain, observability is seen in this yellow highlight. If we flip back to that and then go to monitoring, let's say, so now we can see that monitoring is the one that has the highlight. The relationships are still preserved. Observability is still the parent and instrumentation is still a sibling of monitoring, but now monitoring is the one that's highlighted. And if we click on instrumentation and then go back to ExcaliBrain, then you can see that instrumentation is the one with the highlight. These positions have been reversed, but that's because the siblings can really go in whatever order. If let's say you want to be able to always look at ExcaliBrain in terms of observability, regardless of what note you're actually on, then what you can do is go back here, click on the note that you want it to be linked to, go back to ExcaliBrain, and then hit Link ExcaliBrain to the most recent active leaf. That was observability. So now if we go into the monitoring page here and go back, it's still focused on observability. This is what I usually like to do when I'm creating a note. I like to have the focus on kind of the parent topic, or sometimes, the main topic that I want to be writing about. Now, this is a text field that you can use to search on. The way that we opened up ExcaliBrain this time was from a note, so it showed the relationships for that note. But if we wanted to look for something else, then we can do that as well. This initializing index only happens the first time, and really we can ignore that and it'll still find other things. So for example, my core principles here, these are already notes that I have, and I didn't have to do anything special to them for them to show up in ExcaliBrain. ExcaliBrain is just finding these connections. So from this, I can see that I probably am linking to my core principles from monthly, and that's why monthly is showing up as a parent in this situation. There are also other options here, like showing or hiding attachments. These are like images or PDFs or something like that that you may have in your vault, but may not be very conceptually useful. You can also show or hide virtual nodes. This is actually something that's really interesting. If I click on this, you'll see that a whole bunch of these notes on the side here were gone, and that's because these notes don't exist. Now, in this case, this is because these are templater ones that are automatically generated. But this is one of the best features of ExcaliBrain. Shows you not just what notes already exist, but notes that you've linked to but don't exist. So as you're exploring your notes, you start to think, well, why doesn't that node exist if I'm already linking to it. So in this way, it can show you gaps in your knowledge or in your vault. Now you can also show or hide inferred nodes. Right now, all of these nodes are inferred, and really, unless you're explicitly setting relationships in every single node in your vault, I think realistically you'll probably want to show them for now, but maybe later on you can hide them, because if I click on this, then I'm only on the one page that I happen to specify. You can also choose to show or hide page nodes. Maybe you only want to look at the folders or the tags, and the next two are folders and tags as well. So if I click on show folder nodes, now it's showing that all of these are under the root directory, and then you can also explore your vault through folders. I don't typically use folders that much for organization, so I'm going to take that off. Tags are also interesting. I don't use them too much in this vault. And then if you have aliases in your documents, then you can toggle this as well. I already showed you linking ExcaliBrain, so showing and hiding siblings could also be useful if you want to pare down on the clutter in the view. Some other things about using ExcaliBrain: you can always click and drag anywhere to move this view around. You can hold down Command and then Zoom to zoom in and out if there are a lot of nodes. You can also click on any of these if they exist. So for example, if I click on the monthly page, you'll see it went back to the other Obsidian window, and where I had observability here, it's now gone to monthly. If you click and hold the Command key and then hover over something, you'll also be able to see a preview of that note. So you can also even scroll from here. So this is a really cool way of exploring your notes. I think this level is the best place to start when you're using ExcaliBrain, because you don't have to do anything to your notes in order for ExcaliBrain to be useful. As you can see, you can already explore a topic quite well just by letting ExcaliBrain figure out those relationships for itself. If you're ready though, there is a second level. Level 2 is being aware of the relationships that ExcaliBrain uses and explicitly setting them in your notes. Going back to this example, let's remove all of these ones that are letting ExcaliBrain infer those relationships. And if we go back to ExcaliBrain, you'll see observability is once again an island. Explicitly setting those relationships requires you to use the relationships that are set in ExcaliBrain. So parent, parents, child, children, friend, friends. All of these are valid options. So I'm just choosing parent, child, and friend because it's easier for me. So this is what monitoring looks like right now, because it is on its own, it's not linked to anything, because we've removed those links that helped ExcaliBrain infer the relationship. Instead, we're going to explicitly set it. So this time I'm going to type parent and put observability. Now if we go back to ExcaliBrain, observability is now a parent of monitoring. Now we can do the same thing in instrumentation. I'll say that its parent is observability, and then I'll also add that its friend is monitoring. So now in ExcaliBrain, we can see that we have the same sort of graph here. Observability is the parent, and its children are instrumentation and monitoring. Now they are friends because that's the relationship that we set, but they are actually also siblings. That's inferred by Excalidraw by the fact that they have the same parent, observability. The best use case for ExcaliBrain at this level is to be aware of those relationships when you're creating notes, and then already think about what is the parent of this note, what are its siblings, and what are its children, if any. And that way, as you're building up your knowledge base, you're also building that relationship network or hierarchy. If you're worried about this looking not so nice in your notes, one thing you can do is just put them within these percentage signs, which is going to turn them into a comment. So you could make it look a little bit nicer so that the percentages are on their own lines, but it's still going to work the same way. That way, when it is in preview mode, you're not going to be able to see any of those relationships, but you will see them in edit mode. So now on top of letting ExcaliBrain infer relationships of your nodes, you're also intentionally setting them in your new nodes. But what if you already have old nodes with different keywords that you are setting? What if you have relationships that you want to be classified as parents, children, or siblings, but you're not using those specific keywords? keywords? Well, you can do that by creating your own custom relationships. Now I'm switching over to my main vault to show you some of the custom keywords that I've put in for relationships. So let's go into settings here. This is the ExcaliBrain settings, and you'll see I have quite a few more keywords that I've added into each relationship. These are things that are very specific to me, so they're not going to work for you unless you're also already using these keywords. So some of the things I want to highlight are date published and date. I use this field a lot for contextualizing in terms of chronological order. Sometimes it can be handy to see what I worked on a particular day, and that's why I have date here. And in that sense, the daily note could be the parent of everything else that I worked on. But it could also be something like location. In terms of people, I use this a lot for my CRM or my relationship management tool, where I might want to see the people that I know within a certain place. Like, let's say if I'm going to visit a certain place, I want the people to come up as children to the parent of the location or country. I've done the same with children and friends. These are some things that I've used in old notes. Some of them I don't even use anymore, but it's useful when you start to see these patterns that you put them in here and start to create relationships that are based on your actual notes. And in this way, ExcaliBrain is way more useful because now it's not just looking at the parent, child, and friend keywords, it's also looking at the keywords that you use. At this level, because you're using your own custom relationships, on top of the benefits of the previous levels, you're also adding some organization to your vault, but not just any organization, because you can already do that with folders or tags, but a more meaningful organization that is based on how things are related to each other. And having custom relationships makes that tailored specifically for the kinds of notes that you're taking or the kinds of topics that you're most interested in. However, at this point, it's still more hierarchical. It's still about what's above, what's below, and what's to the side of it. But the thing is, you can also use those same hierarchical relationships to create more semantic relationships. And that's level 4. Level 4 is going to be more about thinking semantically. So for example, in this parents field, I could add things like reinforces, or perhaps in friends, I could add something like contradicts. This starts to add another layer of notes. Now it's not a matter of whether one is a subset of another, but really semantically, what does this concept mean? And how does it oppose or support this other argument, this other concept? I must admit that I'm not at this level yet. I'm still trying to think and experiment about how I'm going to want to do this in the future. But I really think that going to semantic relationships is probably the most advanced use case for ExcaliBrain. Once you do it, however, I think ExcaliBrain really unlocks the full potential of having a personal knowledge management system. So it's no longer just about creating the notes or contextualizing them, but it's also about thinking critically. It's about going back into your notes and exploring topics that come up and regularly going back and maintaining and kind of like gardening those ideas and continually testing them against each other. ExcaliBrain is just one of those plugins that you have to let stew for a bit. It kind of reminds me of DataView. Just like DataView, understanding how ExcaliBrain works happens faster than understanding how to use it most effectively, because it's so personal to how you take notes. But just like DataView, once it clicks, ExcaliBrain has the potential to change how you take notes and how you make connections between them. If you're interested in hearing more about Excalidraw, which is the first plugin by the same developer, check out this video. Vi sant later, Thank you for watching.